we talking about today, Frank?
You'll find out. Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are on my Facebook page. We're watching this recorded later. We are live now. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce an old friend of mine, Marlene Winell, who has many academic credentials. So I should probably say doctor or something like that, but it's Marlene to me, so it will be to you. Marlene and I crossed paths several years ago, actually quite a long time ago, because I think she read a memoir of mine or heard me on some program talking about my journey out of the evangelical subculture, coming from what the New York Times called my family, which was evangelical royalty, which is a weird way to put it. But I got the royalty part because my relationship to my family's leadership was entirely nepotistic. I was born into this, bred, as it were, to take a leadership position. When I met Marlene, because she works with folks who have, I guess you might call post-fundamentalist PTSD, I met someone who really understood my journey without having to have anything explained, beyond which she has a big clinical practice around the world, online and in person, and in a thing she runs her boot camps, which she'll explain, that really help people who come from those backgrounds, and not related only to evangelical, conservative Roman Catholic, all kinds of Orthodox Jewish communities have people who leave as well. So Marlene is a writer. Marlene is a counselor. Marlene helps people. I'm going to ask her to tell you about herself. Before I do that, I just want to point out that you can help these little conversations of mine with authors and friends and other activists by liking this page and telling other people about it. And we will have more such guests coming up in the future. So please keep track by liking this Facebook page and spreading the word. So Marlene, could you introduce yourself as if we just sat down on an airplane and I had explained to you I'm a writer, and you now tell me for a couple of minutes, what do you do, Marlene? And let us know about your own life and what you do for people who come out of backgrounds similar to mine.
Okay. Well, professionally, I'm a psychologist, and I specialize in helping people recover from their religious indoctrination.
That's an answer that would have gotten my 100% attention had we been. I would have spilled my coffee at this point and said, please tell me about yourself and what you do. So when you run into folks who come out of those backgrounds, give me a little idea of the scope of the kind of people we're talking about, the various religions they come out of and so forth.
Yeah, okay. Well, religious trauma, which is the word that the term that we use for this, is really quite a wide range, because people leave their religion for a lot of different reasons, but largely when they've grown up in it, and then they reach an age where they are able to question what they've been taught, and decide to leave. For some people, it is a very rocky road. It's like having the rug ripped out from under you. You lose everything that you've been close to. You lose family and friends. You lose your community. You lose your meaning in life. It can be fraught with all kinds of feelings of anger, of grief, and turmoil. So it looks a lot like an event that would qualify for PTSD. That transition period. But then, and so that was mainly what I was looking at and working with years ago. I wrote a book about 27 years ago called Leaving the Fold. It was kind of before its time. Now there's a lot more attention to this subject. At the time, there really wasn't. And I hadn't been talking about religious trauma so much. I was just addressing a lot of the symptoms that people exhibit who come out of religion. And this would be fundamentalist Christians, this would be Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, an occasional Scientologist, or ex-Orthodox Jew or Muslim, but just all kinds of people from the fundamentalist version of their faith. So these aren't necessarily the progressive members of, say, Christianity, but more the ones that have attended an evangelical fundamentalist group.
Yeah,
then they,
I'm curious about something. If I can interrupt 1 second, then go back to more. Did you have something formative in your own background that, as it were, prepared you to understand the need to address this, other than just your studies or whatever, on the personal side?
yeah.
How did you get to this?
Well, I grew up a child of missionaries. I was born in Hong Kong, grew up in Taiwan, went to Christian boarding school. My parents were with the Assemblies of God. And I actually became a very zealous Christian myself. And my explanation for that is that there were 5 kids in the family. Parents were very busy with saving the heathen. I think that I suffered something that pastors' kids and missionary kids suffer from, which is that you can't really get a lot of attention from your parents, and you can't complain about that because they're doing God's work. And so turning to the church was actually something that I did because I didn't really know anything else. I turned to a very Pentecostal version of it. I became, like I said, very, very devout, very zealous in my teenage years. And then we moved back to the States. We moved to Southern California, where the Jesus movement was going on. So I jumped into that, and that was all very exciting. We thought Jesus was coming back any day. And I was passionate. I've said that Jesus was my first lover, my imaginary friend that meant a lot to me. So over the years, over the last bit of high school and then through college, I just went through a lot of personal changes that were actually pretty difficult in learning more about the Bible, where it comes from, about the religion, and then also dissatisfactions with the church, the patriarchy. I wasn't being allowed to take leadership roles because I was female. And also I met people that were from other worldviews. They were like either not religious at all, or they were believing a different religion and having some of the same benefits that I was having, and realized that Christianity didn't really have a monopoly on any of what we thought in terms of anything really, meaning in life or healings or any of the fruits of the spirit, which is what I was most interested in. And so just realizing that the world was a lot bigger than I thought and that I grew up with. So
at what point in college would you have stopped, say, describing yourself in terms of Christianity that you would have described yourself before? In other words, there was a point in my life when I would have said I was an evangelical Christian or born again. And then there was a point where I said, well, I'm a kind of in a position of doubt now. And then there was another point where I said, no, this is not a position of doubt anymore. I am out of this movement. With me, it was a step process, not overnight. I just wonder what the equivalent in your journey is.
Yeah, I think I was afraid to say that I was no longer a Christian for a long time. And I was just kind of modifying it and excusing it in certain ways, like explaining things in the Bible with anthropological kinds of arguments and trying to hang on to it for a long time. I did have a relationship with a man, and I got married, which kind of broke my addiction to Jesus, because now I could have a real human relationship, hugs in real time and physical. And so it was just after college, and I was married, and I remember an incident where we visited a church in Colorado when we were traveling that was being pastored by the man who married me in a very Christian wedding in California. And afterwards, I just was curious to see what he was up to and sort of dipping my toe back into that whole scene. And then afterwards, I went up to him and said, hi, and do you remember me? You married me years ago. And he said, yeah, well, that's great. Where are you fellowshipping now? Which is what they always ask, right?
Sure.
And I said, actually, I'm not a Christian anymore. And my life is actually a lot better and more full. And he was just speechless. And I came away from that almost shaking because I had said it.
Yeah, you had said it. Let me go back a little bit. Let me just say, I'm Frank Schaeffer. You're on my Facebook page. I hope you follow us and enjoy these conversations and like the page so other people can as well. I'm talking with Marlene Winell right now. Now, Marlene, I want to go back to a point you mentioned before when you were saying that even though you were moving out and you kind of knew you were out of it, you weren't saying it yet until the time you told that pastor. What is the hesitancy between sort of knowing your mind and then that gap when you finally said it and you're kind of left shaking? Explain the hesitancy and just coming out and saying, hey, I'm not one of these folks anymore.
Well, I think that the religion can have an enormous hold on you emotionally, because it does satisfy a lot of things, a lot of normal human needs. It satisfies need for community, meaning in life, and emotional, even if it's imaginary. And you think that you have all the answers. I've heard somebody call this certainty addiction,
right?
Where you know everything, and that's nice. And I had all of that. I was salutatorian at my high school graduation, and I used it to preach.
Yeah.
So I thought my life was pretty well defined. And then when it unravels, it's very confusing because of all those positives. People say, well, why are you so negative about religion? I'm not negative about religion in the positive aspects of it, but there's an underbelly. There's a pretty terrible underbelly. And when you start realizing that and you feel like I think it's kind of like leaving an abusive relationship when there are good aspects as well. And you also
go ahead. Sorry.
Well, you can feel all kinds of confusion, and some of it is frightening. You're in the world now, and you don't know very much about navigating that. And if you don't have this imaginary friend all the time, and you don't have a church to go to every Sunday to keep you grounded, it's wonderful. It's liberating, but it's also really confusing and a little bit frightening.
To change the subject a little bit, since you deal with so many people who obviously have trauma in their lives in leaving their religious backgrounds, as the years go by, I keep running into more and more stories of people who have suffered from incredible levels of actual abuse, physical, mental, and otherwise, within not just the evangelical world, but religion in general. If you think of the way the Saudi regime and its Wahhabist imams treat women, if you think about the arranged marriages for children in Pakistan, if you think about Modi in India persecuting anyone who's not part of his Hindu nationalist thing. Two things that I'd like you to think about and talk to us about, because I'm sure you have some insight. One, why with fundamentalist religion do you get this sort of shadow that follows all of it, whether it's Hindu, Christian, Muslim, Jewish in the ultra-Orthodox communities in New York where women are not educated, for instance, that has this thread of abuse running through it, particularly against women and children, part one. Why is that relationship so solid across the globe? Secondly, what are your thoughts on something that I'd like to say, and that is that I don't think our problems in America with evangelical Christians, the election of Trump, the Trump cult, this authoritarian white nationalist model is unique to America. If you look around the world, you could look at history from a point of view of saying theocracy seems to be on the rise. So you're dealing with people who have left. Seems to me a lot of people are still in there, and they're part of movements globally in many religions which are authoritarian, anti-democratic, and really after theocracy. So I know those are two sort of different questions, but if you could weave together a little bit of an answer on that, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, well, I think that most of the authoritarian style religions that we're talking about have grown away from their origins. There are good things in the Bible, good things Jesus said and practiced, and same with the Quran and other teachings. But they've grown away from that, and they have become much more about power and control.
Yeah.
And you can see that with the kind of bargains that evangelical Christians seem to have made with Trump. They're going to forgive all of his nastiness in exchange for what they think are his policies. And it becomes, and so there are so many, and then individual churches that are being run by charismatic, controlling, very powerful pastors. Then, the patriarchy of the church goes hand in hand with the hierarchies and patriarchy in the culture.
Yeah.
And supports it and makes it work.
Yeah, a question from somebody who's watching this right now, Scott, actually is, thank you, Scott. This is a good question, one I would be asking at some point, so I'll just jump the queue and ask it now. What has the embrace of Trumpism cost the evangelical church in terms of its belief in the Great Commission, spreading the gospel, the good news of Jesus? You must be talking to people who are what I would call casualties of the Trump years, as well as having come out for other reasons. How do you fold all that together in terms of it costing? Let's just say we were both fervent evangelicals still. It would seem to me that we could say Trump has not been good for our movement. What has that cost the movement, even if you were evangelical, let alone from the perspective of someone outside of it?
What has it cost the movement?
What does it cost the evangelical movement? I mean, what direction has it moved it in?
I think that since they have made so many compromises ethically in supporting Trump and his agenda, a lot of people have become disillusioned. A lot of the clients that I have families that they are struggling to get along with, and the election and the insurrection, things like have caused family divisions, to where it used to be that I would work with people in how to maintain some kind of relationship with family, because there's usually a rupture anyway if you leave the faith and you've got a very religious family. But in this case, these ruptures would be so emotional and so fraught with conflict that families would end up just splitting up and not speaking to each other.
And you see that quite often?
Yeah.
And you're thinking the Trump years have exacerbated that?
Yeah, I think the Trump years have been a collective trauma for a lot of people. And that's why recently I got interested in the notion of collective trauma, because I think our whole country has suffered from the religiosity that we have.
Do you find in the people you're talking to any kind of a generational divide? Is there a difference between, say, a 28-year-old client of yours, young woman who comes from an evangelical background, and a guy my age, 68-year-old, who'd sort of been there, done that? Are the perspectives different? Are they the same issues and same questions for this younger person, say myself? What are the differences in questions they ask you, and do you have a different way of dealing with them generationally, or is it always down to the same things? And what are those things, by the way?
Well, remarkably, a lot of the issues are the same, because the religion teaches all these basic ideas, these basic assumptions about human nature and who we are. I've ended up concluding that fundamentalist style religions teach two huge basic assumptions. One is you're not okay, and the other is you're not safe. You're born in sin, you're a sinner, and that's like the basic tenet of human nature. And that's why that salvation is necessary. That's why so many things are necessary. And then you're not safe. You have to worry about the afterlife. You have to worry about whether the world is safe, other people, your life. So those two things can last for decades beyond rejecting the theology.
Just go through that point one more time, the two things that are common to all fundamentalist religion, because I think that's very profound. And then go a little further in saying what the result is of being raised in those beliefs in individual lives.
Right. One is you're not okay, and the other is you're not safe.
Yeah, that's a big thing, because I do childcare for 3 of my 5 grandchildren every day. And I can't think of a worse thing I could bequeath them as a grandfather. You're not safe, and you're not okay. If that's the gift you give a child, forget the religion part. I can't think of a more destructive message. And as I look back on my own life, and I wonder why I have such a hard time getting the ringing out of my ears, I think you really put your finger on it. I've never felt safe, even after leaving. And you're always examining yourself in some way, like a grand inquisitor. Am I alone in that, or do other people carry that even years after they leave?
Oh, it's definitely a huge, huge problem. And so, I can talk to somebody your age who's coming to me for help and have him just break down in tears because it's been it has haunted him for this long.
Yeah. Do
And
you find that folks are able to, I won't use the word heal, but repair the damage, or the scars permanent? Does anybody get away from this?
I think yes, I think people can get much, much better.
Hmm.
I think that we always, forever after, have to take good care of ourselves. We
Hmm.
have to have self-compassion, and we have to do some things deliberately and consciously that maybe other people don't, like the self-care and self-love,
Yeah.
because we have to take responsibility for some of that. We're not turning it over to God or looking for God's will, and we're not expecting the church to do it. And a lot of times the parents aren't going to do it. So, to learn how to be responsible for your own life and learn how to compassionately take care of yourself is a lifelong task.
But Lydia asks a question. It's a good one. Thank you, Lydia, so much for asking the questions that I would be asking a minute from now. Thanks for jumping the gun again here. A question for Dr. Winell. What advice would you give to survivors looking for a good therapist that will help them recover from religious trauma?
Well, you could call my organization. First of all, I have a group of therapists that I supervise that are all meeting monthly to do case conference and talk about what are the best approaches to helping people in this category.
And how would someone do that, by the way? I know we'll post it, but let's go ahead and just mention how someone would get in touch with you and your organization.
The organization is called Journey Free, and the website is journeyfree.org. And if you go there, there are very clear instructions for how to get a free consultation to find out what's going on with you and how we might be able to help you.
Oh, that's really good. We'll jump back in that information. I'm talking to Dr. Marlene Winell. She is a therapist who works with people like me, being a survivor of an evangelical fundamentalist background. And I've known her for a long time. I republished some of her things on my blog. I'm a fan, and I hope you all get in touch with her. And I just remind you, we're doing a lot of these conversations now with authors and change makers and leaders. We'll continue to do them. Please like the page, tell other people, and follow along. Marlene, a question I have for you, on a personal note, is that one of the deficits I brought with me out of my evangelical background that is better now as I have gotten older, and I don't know if that's change in my brain or whether I've thought things through, or maybe talking to folks like you, but anger that comes from places that I don't even know what it's about. So it's never big things. I handle the larger stuff well, but suddenly I will shout at a grandchild. I will, when I was raising my daughter, Jessica, and have long since apologized and been forgiven by her. She's 50, by the way. That's what happens when you get your girlfriend pregnant when you're 17 and 18, which is what I did. But I can remember, as a kid raising her, besides the fact a teenager was raising this girl, when I would lose my temper, I sometimes slapped her. And it's the great regret of my life, looking back. But also I was told by my parents that you had to discipline. The discipline was always physical. I was beaten as a child with a belt. Anger has to be an issue. And it's not just a male thing, I think. And this kind of lashing out, you look in the mirror sometimes and you just say, who am I? Because in the moment when you're not that way, you don't know where this comes from. And I don't know what it's related to, but is that a symptom that people who flee this fundamentalist, harsh background carry with them?
Yeah, anger can be one of them. There are different responses, and something that is important to understand is that all this kind of trauma gets stored in your nervous system and in your body. And so years later, you can be reminded of something, just some little thing can trigger a memory, and you don't even know this is happening. Your brain is essentially confusing the present with the past, because we're wired to defend ourselves, right, as animals. And so we go into fight or flight responses. right? And so and people choose different kinds of responses, but it's basically self-defense. And anger is when some value of yours gets crossed. Something is not okay with you. And so it can be that your response is to fight.
Yeah, in my case, I spent a childhood very much marked by the things you were saying. You're not okay, and you have this deficit that can only be made up with this sort of magical solution. But there was also this sort of level of hypocrisy, and I guess you've run into this being a missionary kid yourself, where, you know, I would see my father preaching a sermon on Sunday, and then that night listen to him yelling at my mother, sometimes, you know, physically abusing, not like beating her. It wasn't like that, but he'd punch her arm once in a while, and she'd come into my bedroom rubbing her sore arm, saying, you know, we've got to pray for Daddy, especially tonight. He's in one of his moods. The kind of interlacing of the public stand you took on one hand and this level of hypocrisy on the other was something that left me really damaged, I think, because it was like, okay, where do I put my foot down on solid ground here? We're preaching this message, but at home, behind closed doors, it's a whole different story.
Yeah. Well,
and my mother, by the way, suffered from the same thing as a missionary kid in China, with her sisters being sent off to boarding schools. They'd come home once a year. They were furious. Their lives completely fell apart. In fact, every single person associated with her family as missionaries fell to pieces at some point. My own family, coming out of the L'Abri Fellowship, a few people have done okay, and a lot of them haven't. So I think you have a lot of clients out there.
Yeah, well, one thing I can say in response to what you're describing in terms of the domestic situation being different from the pulpit, and that irritated me too. My father did the same thing. Christians are not big on psychology or any sort of human system for understanding things.
Yeah.
And so a lot of things get chalked up to sin. You know, if you lose your temper, you have a problem with anger, then it's because of your sin nature. And so you're supposed to just take it to God, right? You pray about it. You may say you're sorry to whoever it is. You take it to God, and God's supposed to fix it. There isn't any responsibility for self-reflection, self-examination, and then learning any skills. I mean, there are lots of things to learn about anger and skills in terms of communication with other people. You can not be exploding like that. There's a lot that you could learn, but you'd have to think of it in terms of learning and personal development, and take that kind of personal responsibility. And they don't. In fact, psychology gets seen as something sinful.
Well, in L'Abri, where I grew up, you know, you went to the Lord with things and so forth. And if a student came through and said, well, they were seeing a psychologist, it was like, well, if you're a Christian, you don't need this. We will pray on it, and the Lord will take care of this. And it's the spirituality in your life. You know, that psychology stuff is fake. So, you know, we were raised as anti-science anyway, but the worst of all was psychotherapy or psychology or analysis. This was like absolutely a secular alternative to what is the spiritual problems in your life, if you could deal with that. Very, very much the way the evangelicals dealt with the gay community. You know, you've chosen this sinful lifestyle. We can help you get out of that. Nobody admitting, hey, folks are born gay or straight or non-binary, whatever it may be. No scientific basis at all. It all went back to the spirituality. But wow, if you couldn't make that work for you, then what you did is you didn't look at the system and say, is there something wrong with what I'm being told? You looked at yourself. I'm not saved. I'm failing. I must not be a Christian.
Yeah, and so people get saved over and over again. And there is a kind of cycle of abuse, actually, that again is a little bit similar to domestic violence, where you're cruising along in your life and you're calling yourself a Christian, but you can't, and the standards are so high. You're supposed to be perfect in so many ways, but you're not achieving that kind of perfection. And so you feel guilty about things that you do, and pretty soon there's a number of ways in which you think you're sinning. and you get guilty enough to where you have to come to God and confess everything. Sometimes this is in church, up at the altar call, and you're on your knees crying and confessing again and rededicating your life to God. And then you get a period of euphoria and reprieve because you feel like you've been cleansed, you've been accepted back. If you didn't think you were saved before, now you think you're saved. And so it goes well for a while. And then the same thing starts happening again because you cannot maintain the ideal perfect standards that they have. And this would be any number of things for a lot of people. It's masturbation, which ends up making you feel like a horrible human being, not just that one thing was wrong. But so you go through this cycle where you're sinning again, and then you come back for another confession and rededication, and it goes around and around, and it's always your fault.
Yeah.
It's always
well, and it's always this, if the missing piece is if you could just get this right. And of course, the most extreme example of that is, physical healing, where you have these faith healers and others, basically the fault is yours, you didn't have enough faith.
right.
And of course, they can all cite Bible verses for this. What I always wonder is that when you look at the kind of people who come from this background, of which, I'm one, what are your best case scenarios of people who deal with this problem and are able to come out the other side restored in a way that you see, okay, here's a real change? What are the sort of tools that you concentrate on when dealing with folks that you see have worked over the years for real, not by giving them another magical solution, but that actually do help people dig their way out of this pit?
Well, one thing is that I realize that this kind of indoctrination can affect people in multiple ways. It can affect you cognitively to where you can't think very well, that you don't know much about critical thinking. You don't think it's okay to have your own thoughts because you were taught not to think. If you ever had any doubts or questions, that was from Satan. So people are unused to being feel like they have permission to even think things through. So there are cognitive deficits. And then there's the emotional part where you just feel terrible about yourself. You've caused all the problems and God hates you, or you don't know how to get right with God, or you've rejected God, but then you're left empty-handed and you don't know where to go with the depression and anxiety. So it's emotional. And then and it's social too, because you often lose your social support system. And then finally, it's physiological, what we know about trauma, and you're having reactions and you're having struggles because your brain is getting triggered by all sorts of things in the past, like what we would call chronic PTSD, which is when there are a million small cuts, is one way of putting it. All of the hundreds of times you were told that you weren't good enough, or that you should be afraid of hell. I mean, children get taught to be afraid of hell from day one, and they can be terrified of the end times. So these fears. So in terms of addressing all of this, we address all those different domains, maybe not all at the same time, but some of the realizations that people can have, such as understanding what the trauma is doing to you and how your brain works and what's going on there. People can learn to slow down, to learn to moderate their emotion and moderate their body relaxation so that they can think well, because when this is going on, your prefrontal cortex goes offline and you can't think straight. So
I have a question that I have that applies, to me, to other people I know. But I find in a completely unscientific survey of just the email I get and so forth, that the perpetrators of the worst damage, because it starts coming from the pulpit, which is a men's only occupation for evangelicals and fundamentalists, and in other religions as well, most of the time. How do you see the link, historical, theological, psychological, of just this sort of global patriarchy and oppression of women to the attractiveness of fundamentalism to begin with? And why on earth has this worked, quote unquote, for so long and become so powerful when it is so oppressive to women all the time, and in the end, psychologically damaging to men who have anything left of their brain to think independently from how they were raised. And it just seems to me that's something I've observed. Now, maybe I've observed it wrong. Do you want to make any comments on that?
Well, usually people come into the religion as small children. You know, they're born into it. This is a generational thing. And you get taught all of this religion without having any choice in the matter.
Right.
And so from a young age, you can be heavily, heavily indoctrinated to where it's a fearful thing to leave. You know, it's not something that you would do lightly. In fact, you don't really even think about it because you're not supposed to think about it. So
Yes.
most people get into the religion in just passing it on through generations, and they don't necessarily notice what's wrong with it. There are a lot when people actually leave, when they get older, they look back and they say sometimes they're embarrassed, you know, what they didn't notice.
Right.
But the other category is people that join as adults, and people join all kinds of different groups.
Sure, they're born again, they go to L'Abri, they talk to Frank Schaeffer, they accept Jesus and they're 21 years old and go from there.
Yeah. Usually there's some problem in their life. Usually they're vulnerable because of that. You know, they might have failed in some way and feel really depleted as a human being.
Yeah.
And here's a religion that's offering you a lot of good stuff. And so
now wait, let's just analyze that. It's offering you a lot of good stuff. What is the good stuff it's offering you that makes it attractive to somebody rational as opposed to the bad stuff? What lures you into buying into the entire system, hook, line, and sinker? What's the good stuff?
Well, the idea of a loving family, one thing, you know, and usually when Christians are witnessing to others, they're doing this love bombing where they're just, you know, trying to tell the person how much God loves them and accepts them as they are, and will help them with whatever's going on, drug addiction or alcoholism or broken marriage or whatever, you know, that there's healing available. And there's this structure, there's this supportive family where all these people are going to take care of you. And like I said, as adults, people usually join when they're at a low point, when they're at a vulnerable stage.
Yeah.
And this also can answer all of your questions. So it's kind of a package deal.
It's a package. Yeah. Sarah has a good question. Thank you, Sarah. Dr. Winell, thank you for your voice. Do you have any recommendations on how to reach people who are completely brainwashed by their religious cult? Great question, Sarah. Thank you so much, Sarah.
This is actually not a big area for me in my work. I generally work with people who have chosen to leave and are looking for help with that.
Well, give us some pointers from what you observed just as an American citizen in a time of fundamentalist craziness.
Yeah. I think that, first of all, it's important to recognize that they're doing it because they're getting some needs met. It's not because they're crazy. Okay, they're getting some needs met. And so have a little respect for that. And then ask a lot of good questions, you know, in a loving way. Ask questions when they are talking about it, and try to encourage their own thinking abilities by pointing out, you know, not lecturing them, because that doesn't work, but to just ask them a lot of questions about what they are talking about.
You know, it's interesting, Sarah, who asked the question, and also Marlene. Look, people ask me, you know, what the point, why, how I got out, being part of this big evangelical family and so forth. Ties very much into what you're talking about, the good parts. The beginning of my journey out of evangelicalism was getting into a leadership position in what I call the big time American God business, and comparing it in my brain to the little humble mission that my parents ran before they got famous, where they were love bombing people and so forth, but they genuinely had compassion and kindness. They were not thieves. It was not a criminal enterprise. They were not raising money under false pretenses. We were eating casseroles because we couldn't afford meat. Dad didn't own a car. He worked on the side of his bed in a rocking chair on a little tray where he did his Bible studies. You know, by the time I got into Pat Robertson's green room at the 700 Club for the 5th or 6th time, or preached from Jerry Falwell's pulpit, or flying around the US in Jerry's jet that he lent me, and was seeing the utter greed and hypocrisy, realizing that the movement I had been born into in its manifestation in the US on the big time evangelical circuit of the 70s and 80s was genuinely a criminal enterprise. I was in bed with con artists who knew they were con artists, ripping people off on purpose, people like Oral Roberts and the whole family that went with him that I knew personally. That was my wake up. It was, these guys aren't real Christians. We were real Christians in our little mission. But of course, once you start questioning that, and you look at what you were told as well, very much in line with what you were talking about, eventually it comes apart in your hands. But people are surprised to learn that it was the hypocrisy of the big time Christian movement that basically began my exit, in the sense it made me ask questions that I hadn't been asking before.
Yeah. And then it crosses your sense of integrity. And then in your own personal development, your integrity becomes more important to you than believing what the crowd believes.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is too, the more I got into sort of a leadership position as a nepotistic sidekick, with the money and access to power and knowing famous people and things that went with it, I would come home off weeks and weeks on the road speaking, treat my wife horribly, treat my kids terribly, regret every moment that I had been away because it kind of wound me up. And I, sorry for the language here, folks, but you're on my Facebook page, so I got to put it this way. But it, in my experience of becoming a male leader, even just a nepotistic sidekick, it was as if I had become a world-class asshole by divine right. And it wasn't me alone, because all the young hot shit movers and shakers that I was meeting, and people like Ralph Reed, who got into the whole thing because of my dad and I, they all became what I feared most about myself, and was for a while before I started my journey out. And I just think there's something to do with male leadership that is particularly toxic when combined with this kind of fundamentalist stuff. How would you look at the patriarchy and male leadership in the light of what not just Christian scriptures, but all sorts of religious scriptures teach about male leadership? It just seems like it's poison to me.
Well, think about your role model, God, Jehovah in the Bible. God is all about power in the Bible. And all of the Bible lessons in the Old Testament and some in the New are about obedience. The flood, that's because people weren't obeying God. The getting kicked out of the garden, sending Jonah, all there, and even Abraham sacrificing Isaac. That's supposed to be such a great story because he was just so obedient to God. It's all about obedience, and God is all about power and control, and he gets to do whatever he wants because he's God. Right? He can order genocide. He can torture Job because and he just flaunts his power that way. So you get the message loud and clear that might is right. And so I ended up writing an article comparing Trump to Jehovah because the parallels are there. And in fact, I think that we live in a violent nation, and I think that we learn violence from the Bible. And violence is so condoned. In fact, the ultimate violence, where God's son gets killed in order to feel his need for blood in order to forgive, that is the most incredible violent story you ever heard. So basically the fundamentalist Christian message is full of violence, and I think that affects our culture. I think that affects whether somebody can think that a strong, pompous leader like Trump is a good thing. Because and I feel that Trump, evangelical pastors who would behave very much like Trump, in a way, almost groomed their communities to accept him, but also in another way, and that is saying that everything that doesn't agree with us is fake. So evolution is fake, climate change is fake, all these other philosophies are fake, science is fake. If it's not in the Bible, it's not real.
that's kind of grooming. I have a good question from Echo. Why do you think, and this is to you, Marlene, that evangelicalism has moved away from focusing on people having personal relationships with God and toward forcing everyone to conform with certain behavioral norms that give the illusion of what would otherwise be the outgrowth of a relationship? And I want to add to Echo's question, which is that the Federalist Society has been grooming for 40 years lawyers to go to the Supreme Court to do just this, like Amy Coney Barrett, who rules in favor of religious freedom and always turns out to be so we can persecute gays or whatever. So religious freedom, in other words, the freedom to make other people conform, is now a higher freedom in America than just ordinary civil rights. And Echo's asking, why do you think evangelicalism isn't all about salvation anymore and is going to this kind of theocracy program of making people conform?
Well, again, I think it's about power. Power being, people have multiple motivations for things, right? Multiple needs. And one is to have agency and power. There's very little agency actually in the Christian message, because you're supposed to look for God's will. You can't do anything on your own. It's very degrading. And so if there's an opportunity to have some power, I think that's very attractive.
Yeah.
The other thing is with this New Apostolic Reformation, the NAR, which is this movement within evangelicalism. The idea is to bring heaven to earth.
Yes.
And this, I don't know, I like to joke and say, they get frustrated. Christians get frustrated because Jesus is taking so damn long to come back. Jerry Falwell, you guys got a little so let's go ahead and try to work on these theocracies ourselves if Jesus isn't going to come set it up. But now the NAR, which is a system of very charismatic churches using lots of gifts of the Spirit, healing and prophecy and so forth. They have this goal of bringing God's leadership, God's will, to all these areas of society, government, education, entertainment, every area of society. And then God will send Jesus back. But they have
and of course that's by the way, that has exactly. And we were part of that in the 70s and 80s, where we helped lay the groundwork by being also part of something called the Reconstructionist or the Theonomist movement, which talked about taking Old Testament law and applying it to American life. Whether it fit in with the Constitutional Bill of Rights, who cares? Because God is supreme. And so it isn't a question of being loyal to the US law or loyal to our form of government or constitutional precedent. And of course, now the Supreme Court has a bunch of people on it. And so do the other federal courts that were appointed by Trump and other Republicans who were groomed to react to civil liberties issues when it comes up against religious values to favor religion. And so we have in place now in the courts in this country a party of theocracy. They don't admit it, but they very much have been groomed by these ideas. And I think it's a genuine threat to American civil liberties. I don't know if you see I know you see that connection, but I think it ties in with what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I think what we have is institutionalized religionism. I've sort of made that up as a term, but it's a little bit like institutionalized racism, where you can be blind to it because it's like the air, it's all around us.
How do you think that plays with the American majority in a democracy, thinking about Republican voter suppression and all the rest of this, when, according to the polls anyway, there are less people going to church, there are less people therefore being born into evangelical families. It's not just whites, by the way. If you look at the Hispanic vote, a lot of the Latinos voted for Trump based on the fact they too are part of charismatic evangelical groups. Anybody who thinks that somehow the brown vote, the Hispanic vote, the Latino vote, the immigrant vote is going to save the bacon for the Democrats in the future doesn't understand that a lot of the people in the Latino community are part of some of the most extreme Pentecostal and evangelical movements that are completely open to being beguiled by white nationalists who say, never mind the man behind the curtain, the fact we hate brown people and soldier, took your kids away from you at the border and all the rest of this. Let's concentrate on, these lesbians, these feminists, abortion. Let's bring Jesus back. At least Trump brought the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem to hasten the return of Christ. I don't think white liberal Americans at the New York Times understand the power of the religious arguments, even in the Latino community, to make them vote for white nationalists, which is horribly ironic, but I think a real something that's really happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to me how certain tenets of the religion can be in the culture and not even be conscious. Like, for example, the lack of agency, the helplessness. Like, we're just these little ants that God controls. And God is, well, even with the pandemic, this craziness about God is in control instead of taking some responsibility for hygiene. One of the ideas is that this earth is temporary. And that God is going to solve everything. He's going to bring justice to evil people. Good people are going to go to heaven. We don't need to. There's this lack of agency where people are not thinking that they themselves need to take responsibility for the culture, and so you're not supposed to think for yourself. You're not supposed to respect your own feelings. And there's all this deferring to authority. I mean, the religion teaches you to defer to authority. So there's, I think one of the biggest costs of the religion in an unconscious way in a society is this lack of agency.
I think that's a huge point. That's a huge point. Go into that a little more. If I just said, talk about the lack of agency that fundamentalism teaches, just make that a little subject for a minute. I think that's a great point.
Well, you're taught to subject everything to God's will. You're taught to, believe a huge number of beliefs about the nature of reality. And you live in an alternate reality. You live in a world where, if you buy into this kind of an alternate identity thing, you're a Christian above all, and you believe in heaven and hell, you believe in ghosts, and you believe in demons and angels. You believe that there's a spiritual warfare going on, but you also think that what your job is to find some way of conforming and fitting into this cosmic plan. It's all under control, and your only job is to figure out how you're going to fit in and help the program. You're certainly not supposed to think for yourself.
When you look at polls of people who don't follow any particular religion, you nevertheless find a high level of superstition, belief in astrology, in all kinds of, magical thinking on other levels, but it doesn't seem to be as poisonous as this all-encompassing fundamentalist religious belief, in the sense that it doesn't seem to strip people of agency to the same degree. Why is it the fundamentalist religion in particular has this ability to strip people of a sense of agency or even caring about the planet? Hey, God's going to resolve everything. We don't care how dirty the water is or how the oceans rise. If it's happening at all, what do we care? God's going to fix everything.
Well, don't forget that the underlying idea for all of it is abject fear of what will happen to you if you don't believe, if you don't conform. I mean, people who have left the religion decades later can still have horrible nightmares and wake up in a sweat because they've been told about the horrible punishment you will get. I mean, in a very big way, the religion is based on fear. Yeah,
absolutely. And I want to get to something before we run out of time that I think, should be addressed. And that is, how is it that beliefs that are clearly irrational, there is no experience in life that points in the direction of the grass being blue and the sky being green and water being dry and air being wet. And yet people brought up in that fundamentalist tradition have accepted a whole series of presuppositions that are as far from reality. How does that power stick throughout a lifetime? In other words, why isn't everybody Dr. Winell's patient now, having gotten out of this when they took their first breath as an adult and looked around? Why does the brain keep going in this direction against all evidence and all experience?
Well, that's a question I have trouble answering because I have siblings. I'm one of 5 siblings, and I'm the only one that's left the faith. The others are still deep into it, and they're as old as I am, and I don't understand that, except that there's the certainty addiction,
Yeah,
and it's a comfortable way to live,
yeah,
and life is very challenging.
yeah.
So to
We've got several people have said what a help you've been to them, Marlene. Stacy says Dr. Marlene's groundbreaking work has helped me immensely. Following are some, people who you personally helped. So thank you from some of the folks who are on my page for the work you do, Marlene. I just want to say that we're in a conversation with Dr. Marlene Winell. And if you would like to get in touch with Dr. Winell, her organization, Journey Free, is there. You can go to her website, Dealing with Religious Trauma. It's journeyfree.org.
Mhm.
And I would encourage you to do that. And also, please like this page and be aware that this is a regular feature now. We are going to be doing a lot of these discussions with authors and game changers and leaders in various fields that apply to things that I'm interested in and that I think you all are interested in because you're on this page with me. More authors and musicians and other people coming up. But Marlene, just finishing up here, going towards the end of this, when you look at the US, is reason winning a little bit when we look at the poll numbers and see less people in fundamentalist groups? Or when you look at the efforts of voter suppression of the Republicans trying to hang on to this diminishing group of people, are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist? How do you see the future in terms of the issues we're talking about?
Oh, I think there's progress. I mean, with Trump, for example, there's a couple steps back and then going forward again. But no, there are huge numbers of people that are leaving fundamentalist religions. I mean, it's huge in those polls to show that. And there are also a huge number of websites and Facebook pages and podcasts that deal with it. There was none of that when I first wrote my book. And by the way,
I mean, you were way ahead of all that.
Yeah, and actually there are still no psychologist authors of self-help books. And I thought people would jump on the bandwagon and write a lot of books about it, but that hasn't happened. There's still a lot of fear. There's a lot of taboo about criticizing religion. So that's still there.
Well, and I find that the media is very cowardly in, for instance, not overtly talking about and linking up the activities of white evangelical leadership and the rise of Donald Trump. It's all Vladimir Putin and the FSB, and they did this and this. There's only, the elephant in the room is very simple. There's only one group of people that made Trump president. That's white evangelical Christians. You take them away as voters, he's never within spitting distance of the presidency. And yet the media talks about poverty in Appalachia or the Rust Belt, anything but the most obvious question. And that is, why are evangelical Christians putting someone like Trump in power, keeping him there? And now 70% of them saying they don't believe that Trump lost, and they're holding out to change the whole Republican Party and kick out anybody who questions that Trump, that Trump is legitimately the president. I mean, it's moved to an area that I never would have predicted, even my worst fears.
It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling. It's beyond anything that I could have predicted coming. How about you? Do you feel the same?
Oh, yeah. It's very, very weird. It's very weird. I can't say I understand all the politics of it, but it is encouraging how many people are questioning and leaving religion. And,
I feel the same. Go ahead.
Well, we have a conference coming up for the first time. There's a conference on religious trauma that's coming up May 11 to 16 online that you can find out about. And there are a lot of really great speakers.
That's excellent. And we can get to that through your website, which is, again,
journeyfree.org. You can find it there. You can also go to the conference website, which is feedloop.com. PHEEDLOOP.com.
Okay, good. Well, listen, that's really great. And before I get out of here, Marlene, just thank you for taking this time for speaking with me and reaching out to the folks who are following. I want to remind people that this has been recorded and will be posted online. So please share it with other people, like this site, talk about the fact we have more people coming, and please share this interview with Marlene. I think it's a really important one. And because I come from that background, it means so much to me personally. Marlene, thank you very, very much for your time. I so appreciate it. You are a hero of mine. Thank you for being here with me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.